It's great to have you with us again this week. Pull up a chair, or in my case, a sofa, and sit down and join us as together we embark on Black History Month together. There are so many things that I love about reading the Bible. One of them has to do with reading each of the four canonical Gospels. That is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I find it fascinating to think about why the authors, say, of one of the Gospels, might decide to include a story from Jesus' life and then leave out another story. I also find it intriguing to think about what the authors think of is the most important detail of the story. A story might be told one way, emphasizing particular things in the Gospel of Matthew, and yet be told in an entirely different way in the Gospel of Luke. I also find it interesting to think about where it is that the authors of a gospel decide to place a story within the totality of Jesus' life. The authors of Mark, for instance, might put a story at the beginning, whereas the author of John puts it at the end. This morning's story of Jesus' call of the first disciples is a great example of how all of these things come into play. For you see, when the writers of John's gospel tell the story and some of the details, they decide to include it near the very end of Jesus' overall story. So late, in fact, that it pops up after his death. And because of its placement there, the story is seen not as a call story, but as a resurrection story. The Gospels of Mark and Matthew, on the other hand, shorten the story considerably. They move it from the end of the gospel to the beginning, and instead of emphasizing the resurrection, they emphasize Jesus' call of the disciples. Now, the authors of Luke's gospel take a slightly different approach than the other three. For they don't put it at either the beginning or the end, they put it a little ways into the gospel in chapter 5. And while Luke does follow Mark's and Matthew's lead, making the piece about the call of the disciples central, Luke, however, adds another element to the story that the others leave out: a miracle. And that, I think, is why I like Luke's version best. For it takes this tried and true concept of what it means to be called by Jesus, and it adds a whole other layer for us to consider. So I want you to listen carefully as I read this epic account of those first disciples' call. And then, when I finish reading the story, let's go ahead and come back together and see if we can figure out how our world, like the disciples, gets turned upside down when we answer the call. So here now, Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11 is read from the Common English Bible. One day, Jesus was standing beside Lake Gennesaret when the crowd pressed around him to hear God's word. Jesus saw two boats sitting by the lake. The fishermen had already gone ashore and were washing their nets. So Jesus boarded one of the boats, the one that belonged to Simon, and asked him to row out a little distance from the shore. Then Jesus sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. Now, when Jesus finished speaking to the crowds, he said to Simon, "Row out farther into the deep water, and then drop your nets for a catch." Simon replied, "Master, we've worked hard all night and caught nothing, but because you say so, I'll drop the nets." So they dropped the nets, and their catch was so huge that their nets were splitting, and they signaled for their partners in the other boat to come and help them. They filled both boats so full that they were about to sink. When Simon Peter saw the catch, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Leave me, Lord, for I am a sinner." Peter and those with him were overcome with amazement because of the number of fish they caught. James and John, Zebedee's sons, were Simon's partners, and they were amazed too. Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will be fishing for people." And as soon as they brought the boats to the shore, they left everything and followed Jesus. And thus ends our sacred reading. So now that you've heard Luke's version of the story, let's dig in and see what it has to tell us about what it means to be called by Jesus. Now, the thing I like most about the story is at what point in our day, or our lives, if you will, that we experience the call. As Peter Eden noted in his commentary, the disciples' call didn't come at the beginning of their workday, after they had had what he said was a good night's sleep and a hearty breakfast. No, he points out, Jesus came to these men and called them at the end of a long workday, after backbreaking labor when they were exhausted and ready to quit. And then he told them to, get this, keep on working. And therein, I think, lies the greatest value of Luke's account. It tells us, Howard Gregory adds, that it is at that point in our lives where we come face to face with our limitations and want to give up, that Jesus enters and asks us to push our boat away from the shore. It's a powerful lesson about what it means to be called. It means that it doesn't happen in a transcendent moment when the heavens open, time stops, and a beam of light shines down on us and us alone. No, most often our call comes in the midst of the monotony of our daily lives and our regular routines. And on this early day of a month set aside for the past 50 years to celebrate the experiences and achievements of our siblings in the Black community, I can think of no better example of that than the creator of what we today know as Black History Month. And let me tell you why I say that. Carter Godwin Woodson, the creator of what has become Black History Month, was born 10 years after the end of the Civil War, on the 19th of December in the year 1875 in a place called New Canton, Virginia. Carter was born to parents named Anne Eliza and James Henry Woodson. And he had just one sister, a fiery woman by the name of Bessie, who herself would grow up to become a poet, a teacher, and an activist. Now, Carter Woodson developed a love of learning early in life, though his education was interrupted when he had to leave the classroom at the age of 17 and turn to the working coal mine in West Virginia in order to support his family. But luckily, he returned to the classroom at the age of 20, and it was there that he came alive. Following his graduation from high school, Carter worked as a teacher for 3 years, and then as a principal of the school for another 3. And he did so well that he was named to be a school supervisor in the Philippines, where he worked 4 more years. Carter returned to the United States at the ripe old age of 32 and lost himself in the study of history. First, he earned his bachelor's degree from Berea College and then a master's at the University of Chicago. And finally, he culminated his career as a student at Harvard, where he got a PhD. And in doing so, Carter Woodson became just the second Black man to earn a PhD from Harvard, the first being W.E.B. Du Bois. But even more impressive, Carter became the only son born to 2 former slaves who ever earned a PhD from Harvard. Now, from there, Woodson had an interesting career. At the age of 40, he founded what was then called the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. At 41, he founded what today is known as the Journal of African American History. At 43, he accepted the position of dean at the School of Liberal Arts at Howard University. And 2 years later, at 45, he accepted a position as the academic dean at what today is called West Virginia State University. Now, with all these details, you might hear him and assume that Woodson was thriving, but he wasn't. For like the fisherman in the boat at the end of, or the middle of today's gospel reading, Woodson's body and soul was exhausted from having to face the limitations that existed around him in the academic fields for Black men. Let me give you just one example of what weighed him down. Like most historians who taught in colleges or universities, Carter had joined the American Historical Association. He paid his dues and supported their work. And yet, when it came time for the association's annual conference, Woodson himself was barred simply because of his race. It was experiences like that and all of the office politics he faced at West Virginia State University that caused Carter to walk away from his teaching career in the ivory towers after just 3 years. But he did go on to work in a variety of positions as an advocate for this new field he was helping to found, a field called Black history. And it was these experiences that caused Carter in the year 1926 to propose something called Black History Week. Now, Woodson looked at the calendar and picked the second week in February to celebrate Black history. And he chose that week because it contained both the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln on one end and Frederick Douglass on the other. And in declaring the week, here's what Carter Woodson wrote in his own words. It is not so much a Negro History Week that I'm proposing as it is a History Week. For we should emphasize not Negro history, but rather the Negro in history. What we need is not a history of selected races or nations, but rather the history of the world, void of national bias, racial hatred, and religious prejudice. The event went on from 1926 all the way until 1970, when a group at Kent State University called the Black United Students and Educators decided finally that 1 week in the calendar wasn't enough. They needed a whole month. And 6 years later, in 1976, President Ford designated February as Black History Month. And every president since has kept Carter Woodson's dream alive. Now, I share that story because Carter Woodson was no different, really, than Peter, James, and John in today's story. For he had labored at his craft for the bulk of his adult life and his days. And just as he was hitting his twilight years, he was exhausted, perhaps a little defeated and ready to go home, for he had had enough. He left the ivory towers and was ready to pack up those proverbial nets. But then, after his resignation at West Virginia State University, at one of his lowest points, a voice came along and called him to cast out his nets in the field of history just one more time. And cast out his net he did. And because of it, the entire field of history has been changed forever. For in a field that was perhaps originally created to celebrate the achievements of whites and of Western civilization, Woodson, by strength of will, helped redefine just whose stories got included in history. And friends, if Carter G. Woodson, if Peter, if James and John can look up from the drudgery and the despair of their daily routines and lives, if they can stop and listen for the whisper of the divine in their ear and follow it, guess what? So too can you. Now, of course, I know that you're going to be tempted to do what Peter did in today's story when you hear that whisper in your ear. You're going to want to dismiss yourself and your ability to contribute by saying some version of what Peter said. Leave me, Lord, for I'm just a sinner. And yet here's the good news that the gospel has for us this day. And the good news is this: you, friend, like Carter G Woodson, are enough. For it is through what you or even the world might tell you is your limitations that God shines through. For you see, when we know ourselves as we really are, we open ourselves to what Howard Gregory said is the potential that resides in us through a participation in the work of God. So in these early days of Black History Month, may we follow the examples of Peter, James, John, and Carter Woodson, and step forward and offer God whatever it is that we have or have left, no matter how late in the day. And then if we step back, we can watch the miraculous unfold. For if we are fortunate, we will come to realize that what matters most at the end of our days is not what we are capable of achieving on our own. No, what matters is what God is able to do through us. May we open ourselves to that possibility. Amen.